Hey everyone, in this video I wanted to look at creating your first VM in Azure. I did a version of this video a couple of years ago, but the portal has changed, there were new options, so I thought, hey, I'll update it and just kind of go through what is really the same content, but just walking through, hey, this is a new experience you might see. Now I'm basing this on the fact that you already have a subscription. This could be a trial subscription, it could be a Visual Studio subscription based on the credits you get, maybe it's some subscription at work. But the idea is, hey, we have this Azure subscription. And I'm working on the assumption you don't have some corporate virtual network defined that we're going to use. We're just going to create everything from scratch. Now, one of the first things you have to decide is where do I want to create this virtual machine? Azure has many regions all throughout the world. So we have to pick the region we want to deploy to. And typically we're going to base that decision on where are the resources we're creating going to be used. We want to get them as close to where they're being used as possible so we get a lower latency, i.e. we're going to get therefore a better performance. So hey, I live in Texas. South Central would be a very natural region for me to use. So in my case, I'm going to use South Central, but go and look at all the regions that are available. There's a nice little map. So you can go and click this map and it will show you a globe of, hey, here's all the different regions that are available to you. For some reason it's taking a long time to load today, just because it knows I'm recording a demo. But it will give you this kind of globe. So if we explore the globe, and I can change the filter to what I want to see. Maybe I'd really just want to see, hey, what are those regions that we have available? See how I can go and look at the map and I can see, hey, lots of regions in Europe. I could flatten this out to just see them super easily. But you can see there's regions all throughout the world that I might want to use. So I can think about, I want to use one that's fairly close to where it's going to actually be consumed. So we're going to pick that region. So in my case, I'm going to use South Central. So I'm thinking, okay, so I'm going to use South Central US. So the resources I'm going to create are within there. So it's within my subscription, within South Central US. And the first thing we're going to do is create two resource groups. I'm going to create a VM. That VM is going to have the virtual machine. It's going to have an operating system disk. It's going to have a network interface. There's going to be a storage account for diagnostics. There's going to be a public IP. And then there's going to be a virtual network that's going to have a network security group. And I might have different types of resource sharing that same virtual network. So in my case, what's very logical is I'll actually create two different resource groups. So I'm going to create one resource group that will be for this particular application. Maybe it's my jump box. So I'll create a resource group jump. And the idea is I would put all the different resources together that are going to get created together, run together, perform a certain job together. And then I'll create another resource group into which I'm going to put my networking resources. So maybe it's my RG net, whatever name you want to use. The reason I'm separating it is really just to show you that they can work with each other. This is not a boundary. I can create a VM here that can connect to a virtual network over here. But I'm going to create these resource groups. So we're going to do that first. So if we jump over to the portal. So within the portal, I can expand out this menu. I'm on the home screen, so I can just click Microsoft Azure to get to the home screen, or I could click home in the menu. And I'm going to go down to resource groups. So you're going to see this option here for resource groups. Now I already have a whole bunch of these, but I'm just going to do create. It's in my subscription. I'm going to give it a name. So let's just call this RG jump. I don't think I have one called that. Now notice we pick a region. The region is just the metadata, i.e. the little bits of information about this resource group. But I can still create resources in it in different regions. So just because the resource group is in, let's say, East US, I could still create things in South Central. But if they are going to be set to one region, I'd probably create that resource group in the same region as my resource. Tags are very, very useful. Your company would probably have tags for maybe things like a cost center, an owner, maybe some metadata about the resource. You're probably going to want to do those. But I would go ahead and just hit create. So that's created that already. And then I'll create another one for my RG network. So I haven't got one for that. And again, I'm going to put that in South Central and hit create. So I now have those two resource groups I'm going to use for this demonstration. Now, the next thing I want to do is actually create a virtual network. Now, there are ways in the portal, if I was just going and creating a VM, it can do all of this for me. But I think it's nicer to understand some of the underlying resources. So we're going to pre-create this. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to create a virtual network. Now that virtual network, I have to create it in the same region where I want to create the virtual machine. I can't connect to a virtual network in a different region than the virtual machine. So when I create this virtual network, I'm going to create it in South Central US. Whatever your region you picked, you're going to create it in the same one. Now that virtual network, I define a certain IP range that it's going to use to give out to resources that I create within it. I need to make sure I pick an IP range that is different from any IP range I'm using maybe in my house, if I'm doing this at home, or my company. So if at home I was using 192.168 something, hey, I'd probably go and use 10 dot something in Azure. If I was using 10 dot in my work address space, maybe I'd use 172.16. There were some select IP ranges that are reserved for internal use only. So the key point here is, hey, I may want to connect these networks together at some point. So pick an IP range that I'm not already using. In my house, I'm a 192.168. So for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to use an IP range of 10.100.0.0/16. And then with networking, we can then divide that into smaller subnets or a portion of that IP space. So then I'm going to create a subnet just at the start of this. Maybe I'll call it infra, that will use a portion of that IP range. So in my case, I can just use the first 3 bits, the first 24 bits. So that would be maybe 10.100.0. And that would be a /24. And then I can create other subnets in the future if I wanted to. So let's do that bit first. So if we jump over, we can go to here. So now I want to, notice I could do create a resource up here and then search, and we'll just do that. But I also have virtual networks down here on my menu. But if I just searched for virtual network, so we go virtual network. Yep, I want to create a virtual network. I'm going to pick that resource group we created. So it was that RG net. For my name, I might just put in VNet South Central. And my region, again, the important thing is it's the same region. Then I have to pick my IP address space. It's suggesting 10.5, but I'm saying, no, I want to use 10.100. And it's also, by default, will often say, hey, it's going to create a subnet. It hasn't in this place. So I'm going to say add a subnet. I'm going to call it infra. And I'm going to use, it has to be a portion of that space, that 10.100. So I'm going to do 10.100/24. So it's using the first part of that address space. My next subnet I might create might be 10.100.1 and then 10.100.2. So I can go through and create additional subnets in the future. So I'll click add. So now I've got this infra subnet defined. Security, I'm not going to add any of these. And again, in my case, I'm not going to add a tag, but typically you would do. Then I'm going to go and create that virtual network. So that virtual network is now spanning all of South Central US. Now, the next thing I actually want to do is we think about security. So that's deployed. But if I think about this, I might want to apply some rules about what's allowed to actually talk to things. And the way we do that is we create something called a network security group resource. So I'm going to create a network security group resource. And what we then do is we apply it, we link it to specific subnets. So in this case, I'm going to link it to this infra subnet. If I created other subnets in the future, I might use the same NSG and link it to those as well. And there are particular built-in rules, but a particular rule I'm going to allow is I'm going to allow RDP, so I'm going to do a Windows VM. If it was Linux, you could do SSH. Now that's normally a really bad idea from the internet. A better option would be, hey, this virtual network, I would use a point-to-site or a site-to-site VPN or ExpressRoute private peering to talk to it. But for maybe your first VM, and I just want to be able to connect to it without other things and minimal cost, I'm going to give it a public IP so that I can just connect. But I don't want that public IP to be open to the internet. If it's just, hey, anyone can RDP or SSH, it's going to get attacked within the first couple of minutes. So what we can do is we can say, hey, I'm going to create a custom rule that's going to allow RDP, in my case, so it could be SSH, only from my home IP address. So it could be your work IP address. So we're going to add a particular rule just to allow that. So if we jump back over to our portal, so we've now got our virtual network. We're now going to search for NSGs, network security groups. We're going to create a new one. Now we're going to put it in our networking resource group because its life cycle, it exists with it. So we'll call it NSG South Central US. We're going to create it in the same region. That's really important. And we just go ahead and create it. Now I need to know what my public facing IP address is. If you just do IP config, for example, on your machine, that's not your public facing IP address. If you're at home, you probably have a gateway from your internet service provider, and it's that gateway that has the actual public IP. It does something called NAT, network address translation, that lets multiple devices at home talk through this one public facing IP. I need to know what that address is. So we can type in what is my IP, for example, on Google, and let's actually have a look at that. So if I just go over here, if I do what is my IP in Google, it's showing me there are websites you can go to, but the fundamental thing here is really just, hey, look, I need to make a note. What is my public facing IP address? Once I know what this is, I'm going to copy it. And then as part of the rule, so we've got that NSG has been created. Now at this point, I could go to my resource group and I could just type net, for example, and there's my RGNet, and we'll see the resources inside it. There's my virtual network, and there's my new NSG. So what I'll do is in my NSG, notice there are default rules. I'm going to add an inbound rule, and I'm going to say, hey, the source is a particular IP address. It's my public facing IP address. My destination, I'm going to do service tag, and I'm going to say it can talk to anything in the virtual network. You could also restrict it to just the IP address of the VM you're going to create. I'm allowing RDP, so it's going to be port 3389. I'm going to allow it. I can set a certain priority, and it's giving me a default name. So I can just say add. Now, things like just-in-time protection that's part of Defender for servers basically creates this rule dynamically for a fixed period of time and then removes it automatically. So that's a better solution than having this very static rule. But this is definitely better than just having it open to the internet. Now, right now, this NSG is not linked to anything. So the next thing I would do is I'd want to link it to that subnet. So if we go back and we go and look at our virtual network and we look at our subnet, there's our infra subnet. Well, right here, I can go ahead and I can pick that NSG we just created. Now, I've got multiple ones, but I know it's in that RG resource group, and that was the name I selected. So I'm going to link it to the NSG and hit save. So now when I create a resource and link it inside that subnet, I should be able to RDP to it from my home address, but only from my home address. So that's really the key point of all of that. I could also manually, for example, go and create the public IP address now, but we'll do that as part of the VM creation. The only other thing I am going to do in advance, just again to walk through some types of resource, is there's going to be a diagnostic storage account it's going to use. Let's going to go ahead and create that as well. So this time, this storage account is part of my virtual machine. So we're actually going to create that in the resource group for my VM, so RG jump. Now this has to be unique. So this could be Saviltech, South Central US, jump store. It has to be in the same region, so it has to be South Central US. And at this point, it can just be standard. I only need locally redundant. So this is, hey, do you want a copy of this hundreds of miles away? I don't care about that for diagnostics. I just want it as cheap as possible. And all the rest of these things, I can just leave as they are for now. This is not that important. So I'm just going to review and then create. So what we have now created is this diagnostic storage account, but we've created that inside our jump box resource group. So now I have this concept of a storage account that we're going to be able to use for diagnostics. So we have a storage account created. At this point, we can create our virtual machine. Now, when we create our virtual machine, obviously, yes, we're going to create our VM. It's also going to have a disk for the operating system. So we're going to create a managed disk. I'll use the old style disk. So that's going to be for the OS. There are different types of managed disk. Standard hard disk drive is the cheapest. It's also the lowest performance, the highest latency. Then there's standard SSD, premium SSD. There are lots of different types available. If this is just your lab and you're trying to do it as cheap as possible, probably just a standard hard disk drive is fine. But realize the performance goes up with the different tiers. Also, the bigger you make the disk, the higher the performance you'll get as well. Additionally, a virtual network interface card will get created. And that NIC, we're actually going to connect into that subnet. So it's going to get an IP address from that subnet. We're also going to create a public IP so we can connect to it via the internet. And we're going to link that to that NIC as well. So we're going to create a number of resources as part of this. And of course, we're going to connect to this diagnostic storage account so we can write diagnostics data to it. So all of those things are going to happen in this next step. So now if we jump over, let's create the virtual machine. So I can go to virtual machines. Now I have some, but ignore this. You would do create Azure virtual machine. So we're in here. And again, if you weren't seeing this from home, I could just do create a resource. I could look at all services. I could hit create a resource in this top menu here. So there's lots of different places I can do this. I do create a resource and I search for virtual machine. Resource group. Well, mine was my jump. I give it a name. So by default, this name will also be channeled inside the guest operating system. So I might call it my VM South Central US jump. It has to be the same region as that virtual network. So South Central US. You have availability options. Now, it might be, I don't care about this. I can just do no infrastructure redundancy required. If I do availability zone, you'll notice it's giving me an option. What this is based on is I drew this idea of just a region. But the reality is behind the scenes, that region is made up of multiple sets of data centers. And the way that actually works is they're grouped into 3 sets. And really there's kind of an AZ1, AZ2, and AZ3. I'd want to create all the resources in the same availability zone. So if I care about resiliency, if I'm going to create multiple VMs that are offering a certain service, well, I would like them to be spread over different sets of data centers so that if something happened to one set of data centers, all my other VMs that offer the service are still available. So I would create one VM in AZ1, one in AZ2, one in AZ3. Some services will do this for you automatically, like a virtual machine scale set or an AKS cluster. I can pick, I want it zone redundant. The way it does that is it creates resources spread over those particular zones. My virtual network, even my subnets, I drew this kind of here, but the reality is the subnet spans all of the availability zones. It's not bound to a particular AZ. I could connect, I don't have to worry about that element. If I don't care, if I'm just creating this one VM, if I say no infrastructure redundancy required, Azure just gets to pick. It doesn't expose which AZ it created it in, it just creates it in any AZ I want. In my case, I don't care, so I'm going to say no resiliency required. But that's what that does. If you picked multiple zones, it will just go ahead and create multiple VMs, but there's no relationship between them. It's not synchronizing between them. It's just creating multiple VMs for you. But I'm going to say no infrastructure redundancy required. Again, in a production, if you had multiple VMs, I definitely would want to create them in separate availability zones. Security type, the new generation 2 virtual machines, which are based on UEFI instead of BIOS, have a virtual TPM. I can get features like secure boot attestation from the firmware all the way through to the operating system. That's what this trusted launch option does. But it does limit certain types of features available within the operating system. They're getting fewer and fewer. But for most of us, standard is actually fine. Then you get to pick the image. By default, it's suggesting a Linux. Notice it's a Gen 2. But for now, I might just pick, hey, Windows Server. Or if it's a Visual Studio or you've got the right licenses, I can go and do a client operating system. I'll just pick Windows Server 2022. Then you pick the VM size. A B2S is a burstable virtual machine. Burstables are very nice. They're one of the cheaper options because I get a portion of a virtual machine, but then I'm allowed to accrue credit if I use less than the allocated amount. So if I have short-term bursts of CPU use, a B series lets me do that. So it's a really nice cheap option, but it can burst if I have these short periods where I need more CPU. So a B, especially in dev environments, is a nice cheap option for us. You'll also notice, actually, let's go back to that. We do have this, hey, do I want to use spot discount? The idea of spot is, well, Azure seems to always have capacity. And the reason it has that is because it has tons and tons of nodes with VM space. Well, rather than having it just sitting idle waiting for a customer to create a virtual machine, I can use that spare capacity and pay less money. So what this lets me do is, well, I can use it and it will even show me history of, hey, based on this particular SKU, what would I typically expect to pay? And what's the chance of eviction, for example? So let's pick a different SKU that actually has spot. So here we go. So I can see in certain regions, I would actually pay less money for this much, much cheaper resource. And then it's showing me, hey, if I create it in South Central, there's a very small chance it will get evicted. Whereas West US 3, there's a bigger chance it would get evicted. Central US. So I might go and pick a different region, because I would pay less. But in this case, South Central is a really good one for the D series. It's a very low chance of getting evicted. So that might exactly fit what I want to do. But realize you can get evicted. If they hit a capacity constraint and they needed that capacity for pay-as-you-go customers, your VM will just get stopped. So if you want it for learning and you don't want to get kicked off, I probably wouldn't use spot. But if it was, hey, I had some batch job that was resumable and could be interrupted, spot is a really good option for that. Now, because it's Windows, it's now asking me for a username. So I might say local John, for example, and then I need a good password. So I would put in a password, type it twice. If it was SSH, I can use public key. And I can actually use that and it will store that. I'm not going to allow any inbound ports. And you might say, wait, I need that. We're doing it at the subnet level, so I do not require this. If this was a work subscription and my company had software assurance, especially when I'm using Windows, the Windows license is part of the cost. If I have software assurance, I can check these boxes and I basically pay less money for the virtual machine. If I'm using Visual Studio, however, I already am going to get a discount as part of it just being a dev test subscription, so I don't need to do that. So that's the basics around, hey, my virtual machine. Next, I have to pick the disks. So by default, it's saying premium SSD. That's good for production, but the reality is for my little cheap learning, I really don't need that. A standard hard disk drive is fine. I want to delete with the VM. For some VM SKUs, you will get enable encryption at host. I don't need that. I can also pick, hey, do I want to encrypt it with a customer managed key that I would put in a key vault? That's a more advanced thing with a disk encryption set. I'm not going to talk about that here. I could select if I want to use Ultra disks, and then I could attach additional disks, maybe data disks, for example. Again, I don't need that. I can add them after the fact. I can hot add, I can hot remove data disks. Excuse me. There are also advanced options. Some of the VM SKUs will let you do an ephemeral OS disk. An ephemeral OS disk basically means instead of this being a managed disk that I pay for, well, this VM runs on a certain host. That host typically provides, for many VM SKUs, temporary storage. It provides cache. If it's an S variant of the virtual machine, that means it can use premium. Well, it will use some of that space to actually store the OS disk. So it will provision faster, it will give me very, very low latency, but I'm going to take a hit against my temporary, against my cache space. But if it's a stateless type workload, like a virtual machine scale set, that's a really good option. It helps me save money and actually improves my overall performance. But for now, we don't care about that. We're just going to use a regular disk. The networking, hey, I want to use that virtual network we created. So I want to use my VNet. I want to attach it to that subnet. And I am going to let it create a new public IP. I do not want a NIC network security group, which is offering, because remember, we created one at the subnet level and it's detecting that. It's saying the subnet you're using, you already have an NSG. It's not recommended to add one at the NIC as well. Now you might think, oh, well, no, I should do the NIC as well because then it's 2 layers of protection. It doesn't work that way. Network security groups are enforced at the host in its virtual switch, the virtual filtering platform. If I add an NSG at the NIC and the NSG subnet, they're enforced at the same place. It's not giving me 2 layers of protection, it just complicates things. So it's better to just do it at the NSG. So that's going to go and attach it. It will get an IP address from that subnet. I don't need a load balancer. I can say, hey, if I delete the VM, delete the NIC as well. I might have, for many SKUs, accelerated networking. If it's available to you, turn it on. All it does is improve performance. It can bypass that virtual switch and it uses hardware. So it's going to make the networking better. So if you have the option, turn it on. Then we have management. Defender for Cloud. This is a really powerful solution to help me improve the security. There are then additional add-on things I can do like Defender for Servers that give me that just-in-time protection and much, much more. I can enable boot diagnostics. Now it's saying for managed, or remember we went and pre-created it. And it's detecting, look, you already have that storage account you created. We'll just use that. I can turn on guest diagnostics as well. And that will then, hey, it will get metrics for my virtual machine, and then I can leverage those. So yeah, I want guest diagnostics. So that's actually going to take things from the guest OS, not just from the hypervisor host. Then there's things like identity. Hey, I want to create an identity for the Azure resource itself. And that's really useful that, hey, if I was going to run processes inside the VM, rather than having to store a password, it can just, as itself, be given permission to another resource. So then processes inside it can just act as the virtual machine's identity. So it solves having to store credentials and mess around with keys. Again, this is beyond what we're trying to do in this demo, but that's a really powerful thing, that if I was running processes inside this guest, that we're going to go and interact with other Azure resources. Yes, managed identity is definitely something I would want to do. I can log in with Azure AD, so it will actually go and Azure AD join this to my Azure AD tenant. Automatic shutdown. If this is your dev test environment, this is super, super powerful because it will shut it down for me, which means I stop paying for the compute. I'd still be paying for the managed disk. It can't delete the disk because then I'd lose my state, but it will deprovision the VM from the host. So then I stop paying for it. It will save me money. And I'd have to come in the morning and turn it back on again. So I can say, yes, shut down automatically, and I can set the time zone I want that to happen for. I can enable disaster recovery. That would set up an asynchronous replication to another region I pick. So if this was an important VM running an important workload, I can at the disk level set up a replication of that disk to another region. It's automatically, in this case, going to patch within the guest operating system. Then there's things like extensions. So a really useful extension might be around anti-malware, for example. So I might say, hey, if I go and look, I can run scripts, but if we keep going, Microsoft anti-malware, hey, I'll add that to it. I could then add certain exclusions, what properties I want, but I'll say create to that. There are other things, configurations, reservations I can do. None of that for what we're trying to do we have to worry about. Review and create. It's going to show me, okay, this is what I'm going to pay. Yep, this all looks good. Now notice, one of the things I have here, download a template for automation. While we are creating this through the portal, which is great to understand what's going on, in production, we normally use infrastructure as code. So this will actually give us the underlying JSON that it would use to create this. So that's, again, a more advanced option, but realize that is there, and you might want to go and download that. Then we'll say create. So what it's now going to go and do is kick off this deployment. So it will now go and start using and creating. We'll see it create a whole bunch of different resources. If we look at our resource group, let's go and look at jump. So we had that storage account we created already, but we'll start to see resources will show up as it starts creating things for the VM. So we see it's created the virtual machine. We can see it's created the network interface, and we can see it's creating the public IP. And it's actually saying I want to do to the public IP address, because by default, it won't have a DNS name. And I would like to be able to just connect to the DNS name. So one of the things I might add here is it has to be unique, but maybe it's Savile Tech, South Central US, jump box. And hit save. So now I'd be able to connect to this with a DNS name instead of having to try and use the IP address or something else ugly. So this is a very useful thing to do. And if I go to the overview, there's the DNS name. And notice it's giving me this nice option, copy to clipboard. So I'll be able to use that to actually connect to it. If I go back to my resource group, I can look at deployments. Okay, so that's where we created the storage account a little while ago. Now we can see it's deploying the virtual machine, and I can actually go and track the status of everything it's doing. And we can see this one, the VM creation, is still running, but we can see it's created those really 3 resources. We already created the storage account. So if we think about exactly what it's doing, so we've now seen it's created the VM, it's created the NIC, it's created that public IP, and we should see that managed disk get created as well. So if we go back over here, so it's created a task, which is going to auto shut down for us as well. it's created the extension. And what we should see is the managed disk. So it's going along. Let's go back to the resource group. Oh, there's the disk. So there we go. I was wondering, why can't I see the disk? So there's the OS disk that's created as well. And so there's our disk. So we're seeing all these different resources created as part of it. I think it's still provisioning it right now, but we start to see the details around it. We'll see those extensions that we added. So we will see, there's the anti-malware we selected. So that's going through a process right now. So it's populating those various pieces of information. But it says it's running. So we could actually try connecting to it. I think it's still, deployment is still in progress though, so we're trying to jump ahead a little bit. But at this point, once this finishes, it would have provisioned this resource. This is all kind of live in time. Normally we would be a bit more patient and wait for this to finish. But we can see it's gone through and created all these various things as part of that virtual machine. And again, the way we can connect to it, this was Windows, so I could do RDP. And it will give me an option from the virtual machine directly. So if I went and looked at the virtual machine, there we go, you'll see this connect option. And that was, hey, it's got an RDP. And what this will do is, hey, look, it's showing you the IP address. It will give you an RDP file. So we'll actually go and generate the RDP based on what we have here. Now notice it went and did a check. It's like, hey, you're not going to be able to connect based on the rules. It's looking at what is my public IP and what are the IPs I defined inside the NSG. That's okay because I actually did that what is my IP in the test from a VM in Azure. So if I actually just go and use the name directly, so you can see it's showing me the DNS name of that resource. If I just get that name one more time, so I'm going to copy that. If I jump over to my actual VM where I had that public IP, and from here, if I type in that DNS name and do connect, it needs a name. So that was the name that I created for the instance. And maybe I typed it wrong. We'll try one more time. There we go. So, okay, yes, I want to go and connect. And now I'm inside that virtual machine. Now, one of the things I will see is obviously I have my OS disk. I will also see a temp disk. So that's using storage that's local to the virtual machine. Now, not every VM SKU has this. If I was to go and look at all the different ones available, some of them no longer have temp disks. But what it has done is on the host that's using this, it's taken a portion of its local storage and attached it as a temporary drive. But if I deallocate the VM, i.e. stop paying for it, I will lose the contents of that. So never put content we care about on that disk. So let's see if this is finished. Okay, so we're logged in over here. And I can now do things. So if we look up Explorer, it's still starting. There we go, look at Explorer. This PC. So we can see I have my OS disk that I created, but I also have this temporary disk. And if I look at the temporary disk, it's even got a data loss warning file. Hey, look, don't put things on me. This is a temporary disk. You're going to lose stuff if you try and put things on this. So that D drive is great for, like, Windows will put the page file on it. I might put a temp DB on it if it was a database, because it's local storage, so it's very highly performant, but I will lose it if I actually deprovision this virtual machine. I could go and add additional disks now if I wanted to. I can go and enable other types of features. When I'm finished with it, or if I'm done for the day, make sure you shut it down. Now, if I shut it down from here, this is actually not doing what I want it to do. Because by shutting it down there, all I've done is at the guest operating system level, shut it down, but it has not deallocated it from the actual host. So what this means is I'm still paying for it. It's actually not in the way I want it to be. So notice it says stopped, but it's not actually stopped deallocated. So this is not a good status because I'm still paying for this resource. If I was to just go and look at virtual machines, let's see if it still warns us. So notice here, it's actually still trying to catch up. But what it used to was it would warn me. It would say, hey, you're stopped, but you're not deallocated. I want to be in a deallocated state. And so to get that, I need to stop it from a command line. I need to stop it from the portal, because you notice I still have the stop option. So if I now click stop, this will actually go ahead and deallocate it from the node, and then I stop paying for it. Now remember, I'm still going to pay for the disk because the disk is a separate resource, but it will mean I no longer pay for the compute side of it. So once this finishes, it should then go to, right, now it's actually deallocating from the node, then it will go to stopped deallocated. And that's the status I want it to be in to really, hey, save my cost. And there we see the status we want, stopped deallocated. Hey, I'm not spending my money. And that's what that task we set up as part of the creation was. That auto shutdown task is going to do that for me every day automatically. And again, you can customize that. I could create tasks to automatically start it as well. And there's other things I can do. There are things like insights I can turn on to get some nice views about the key counters that matter, that will require Log Analytics Workspace, which will cost you some extra money. Again, this was really kind of the cheapest option we could possibly do. But hey, that's really the basics around creating a virtual machine. Now, once we're finished, one of the nice things, remember, we created all of these resources in this resource group. When I'm finished, I can just delete the resource group. Hey, are you sure you want to delete it? Yes, it's going to make me type in the name to make sure I'm not doing something silly. It's showing me every resource it's going to delete, and I can say yes. So make sure you clean up after yourself. That's why it's nice to put things in separate resource groups for any little project you're doing, because then I can make sure I can clean up and I'm not paying for some stray disk or some stray IP. It helps you these days. For a lot of the things, it will actually say, hey, there's those checkboxes for delete IP, delete disk when I delete the VM. So it would help that happen. But it's really good to use the resource groups for that purpose, just to keep things as clean as possible. So, hey, that's gone. My network is still there, which doesn't cost me any money. Network's still there, so I could create other things in the future and connect to it. So that was it. That was our updated creating a VM in Azure. I hope that was useful. Until next video, take care.